Mediated Conversation on SAfm.
26 minutes to 9 the time. Good morning to you. Time for your Mediated Conversation this morning. 10 days ago, the latest crime statistics revealed there had been a 22% increase in the number of murders in the first quarter of this year compared to the first quarter of last year. The number of contact crimes, in other words, crimes against a person, went up by 15%. Now there's a new report on urban crime by the Urban Safety Reference Group in the SA Cities network about what is happening in our cities. They predict that, in fact, we're likely to see this increased level of violence and crime in our society for some time to come. They also point out that the most reported crimes take place in a relatively small number of places. I'm going to put it in numbers. Around half the murders reported are reported to just 11% of the police precincts. This demonstrates how important it can be to drill down into the data to find out exactly where crimes are occurring and why. So then, what can we learn from this? What role can cities and councils play in bringing down our violent crime rate? First, you'll hear from some of the people who wrote the report. Siphelele Ngobese is a researcher at the SA Cities network. Then you'll hear around governance. Siphelele Swana is a political analyst and governance expert. Is there a link between a failure of the state, particularly at the local governance level, and crime? Maybe not. And then Andy Mashaile is an Interpol ambassador nowadays, but spent a lot of part of his life working with community policing forums. We'll ask him about the role that organization can play in bringing down crime in areas of high crime rates. We start then with the researcher at the SA Cities Network, Siphelele Ngobese. Siphelele, good morning. Thanks for your time.
Morning, Stephen, and morning to your listeners.
You conducted this in-depth look at the crime in our cities. What were the main features that strike you? What did you find?
So the most striking thing that you've already spoken to, I think the messaging that keeps coming across that we need a particular focus on cities and the cities that we've profiled now. But I think most striking is that the upward trajectory of most crimes, especially the violent forms thereof, will likely sustain in the medium term, and this is due to social, spatial, economic driving factors, coupled with, our challenge as a country with regards to poverty and inequality. And why we say that we need a particular focus on cities is that cities contribute about 80% of the gross value add to their communities and to their countries. And if they are particularly burdened with the lion's share for most crime types, they are not able to move more of our people more to sustainable livelihoods and better livelihoods. And as we know, cities are where a lot of us have the best chance of improving our lot in life. And so it's quite important that you zero in on cities and you study and understand what some of the key drivers of crime are in specific areas and zeroing down on what the distribution of crime is and how you should then target your responses thereto.
This incredible number that half of our murders are reported in just 11.5% of our police precincts. I mean, this really tells us that violence is concentrated. I'm sure if you were to look at where this violence is concentrated, you're going to find probably that it's in sort of big, poor areas.
Yes, correct, Stephen. Quite apt. You did mention what we found is that 50%. Just if you were to use just murder, the indicator of murder as a proxy to understand violence and crime in general. It happens in 50% of murders occurred in just 11% of police precincts. And as you know, national crime data doesn't quite let you know where exactly crime is concentrated. However, it's important to know the distribution so that you can tailor your responses. And, fortunately, crime is not distributed evenly across the city. There are what we call crime hotspots, and the sooner you can locate the crime hotspots and study and understand what the drivers are in each crime hotspot, you can achieve a relative reduction in crime across the city. And so we advocate the targeting and understanding of crime hotspots in the city and that enabling a city to be able to plan for safety much more efficiently in a way that also allows the city to leverage quite limited budget allocations. And as you know, there's been a lot of in the period under study. There's been quite a lot of stresses and shockers that have also impacted city budgets, and so the point of targeting becomes much more important when you're speaking in the context of the shocker and stressor that was COVID-19, followed by the unrest that we saw in July last year, and other significant challenges that have come to city budgets for various functions.
I'm sure we will find as well that these areas will have a much higher person to police ratio than richer areas. So the obvious response to that would be to say we need to pump as many police officers as possible into these high murder rate areas. And even if we then reduce the number of police officers in other areas, this would still have an effect. But is it as clear as that?
It's not as cut and dried as that, Stephen. I would say that, of course, especially when you're speaking to disadvantaged areas and when you understand that crime and violence, while it affects us all, its impacts are most acutely felt by the most vulnerable, including women, children. You will have seen in the quarterly stats that there's been a sharp rise in the murder and assault of women and children. And so you do need to have this view where you are looking to improve the conditions for the most vulnerable in our society. And so side by side with policing, I wouldn't say that there's no need, there's a need for less policing. You do need more policing, as one of the key factors and one of the key drivers is that some of these places are severely under-policed. However, you do also need to have another facet of your intervention that is looking at social intervention, that is looking at economic driving factors and spatial factors as well, with regards to the impact of crime and violence on women particularly. We are finding that, the sites of GBV, of gender-based violence and femicide, the leading sites are the household, public space as well, followed by liquor outlets. And so you do need spatial interventions that look at public space and how to make public spaces safer. And cities like Ekurhuleni are getting really stuck into interventions that try to make our public spaces, our pavements and parks safer for women. You also need to drill down to the household level and think in a social way about making spaces safer as well. And so I would say that side by side with policing, you need other longer term interventions that really look to improve the conditions of safety, particularly for the vulnerable. And the logic is that if you focus on the vulnerable, then you could achieve safety for the rest of your society.
So how important then is urban design, and particularly around women having to walk home at night or trying to just walk through a public area at night? I mean, lighting is key to that, but so is design, so that people can actually see. If there's a narrow, dark alleyway, well, that's very dangerous. If there's an open space that's well lit, well, maybe that's safer. Maybe it isn't, but maybe it is.
Urban design is essential. From what we've studied and what we've come to understand, the way space is designed can either heighten the probability of crime and violence happening, or it can kind of regulate it. And so, of course, what you're saying about well-lit areas is extremely important. Also, just fencing. If you are able to see to the streets, if you have eyes on the streets, that can improve the conditions of safety in that space. When you have activated public spaces such as parks, spaces that work, spaces that are really populated with users, that tends to improve the conditions of safety, particularly for the more vulnerable in our society. We are finding also that, walkability along transport routes, and so driving a design that is less about the car and is about non-motorized mobility and foot traffic can be some of the things that improve upon safety. And so, we've got our high walls, we are all sheltered in our cars, but, there are conditions for the pedestrian that where pedestrians could benefit greatly for us designing our streets and our public spaces more for the person rather than for the car.
Siphelele Ngobese, thank you. Research at the SA Cities Network. I do appreciate it. You're with SAfm. 8:45. Your Mediated Conversation continues around urban safety. How do we make cities safer? Sandile Swana is an analyst in governance. Sandile, good morning. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Steve, and to your listeners.
I would imagine one of the things that we'll see is that where you have poor levels of service, bad councils, let me put it like that, you're probably going to have a high crime rate. I wonder if there's maybe a link between a sort of abandonment of people in terms of services and a high crime rate. People may well feel that they've almost been given up on by the state in some cases.
Yes, there are many studies that have proved what you are saying. Once you allow your city to be ghettoized or to be turned into a slum of one kind or increasingly becoming a slum, the inclination of people to do bad things actually increases. But just to put that very quickly into perspective, remember that it's only about 25% of our municipalities that provide a minimum of 95% of the households with electricity. So it's only 25%. As far as electricity is concerned, it's only about 25% of our municipalities that are doing their job. When it comes to refuse removal, it's only about 50% of the municipalities that provide at least 50% of the service. So the majority of citizens are actually living in slum conditions. Now, what is the other problem from a governance perspective? One of the problems that I've even experienced where I live in Mogale City is that the councillors have got no serious intention to enforce the bylaws. So when people don't live under law in a regulated environment, so then petty crimes increase to murder, increase to rape, and increase to all sorts of things. Two, what we've seen in our city here, and I believe it applies, I've been a chairman of the CPF here, I'm currently chairman of rural safety here. So what you then see is that our security companies, as well as patrollers, who are critical to combating crime in the community, have not been recognized by the municipality as peace officers with powers of arrest. And on top of that, the people who are what you might call slum dwellers, squatter camps, and people who dwell in underdeveloped areas are not actually being inducted into a culture of law-abiding lifestyle. And at the same time, we must remember that there are two types of people who commit crime, the majority of the crimes. Either it's friends or relatives, people who know each other, that's where conduct crimes come from, or people who live in the area. So it's either coming from a domestic type, family type relationship, or it comes from people who live in the area. So if you are a ward councillor and you are not clear about the type of people who are here and what type of lifestyle they are living presently and an ideal lifestyle they should be living going forward, we're still going to have a long-term problem. And the last one I want to add is economic development. When you drive out and you see men carrying beer at 11 in the morning, no work to go to. Some of our towns have got 80% unemployment. 80% unemployment and poverty, some of them. So you find that in that situation, one way or the other, somebody's going to end up beating somebody or stabbing someone. And you go to some of these towns, and I've been there, the economic development investment unit is dysfunctional. Even in the number one performing municipalities, the investment unit, the enforcement function is dysfunctional. So let me stop there.
There's so much that you're saying, Sandile. The question, of course, then comes around how we change all of this. And I'm sure someone somewhere will say we have the resources. It comes back down to the same problem that so much of the problems in so many of our councils comes back to, which is politics and political will. And if we have things working in the mayor's office and in the speaker's office and in the member of the mayoral committee for electricity and sanitation's office, then things should get better. And yet there's very little evidence that our councils are improving at all.
Our councils are not improving. And at the same time, I think that we as citizens, for instance, those of us who are not politicians, we need to actually compel the municipality, whether through court processes, through participation in petitions, through participation in ward committees, through participation in public participation processes. And we put down tangible solutions. As an example, if we say go and establish an anti-land invasion unit, strengthen your public safety unit as a municipality. Some of our citizens, and I've seen this in action, it has happened here in meetings that I'm chairing or leading. In a short space of time, you raise money for cell phones. Sector vans have got cell phones in a split second. So the community is ready and willing to contribute. The leaders, other than the politicians, need to also step in and channel politicians, whether they even if they are kicking and screaming, into doing the right thing. And our politicians need to know, no matter who they are, that in a shorter space of time, we as residents, as property owners, can actually remove them from office. And that has been hidden because we have tended to fear politicians rather than treat them as elected and de-elected or unelected representatives as time goes on.
Sandile, thank you very much indeed. I really appreciate it. Sandile Swan is a political analyst and governance expert. In a moment, someone with a lot of experience of community policing, Andy Mashaile. You were there, SAfm. It's 9 minutes to 9.
Mediated Conversation on SAfm.
7 minutes now. Excuse me, I'll start again. 7 minutes now to 9 the time. Your Mediated Conversation continues around urban safety, crime in cities. Andy Mashaile is an Interpol ambassador, but has spent a lot of time working with community policing forums. Andy, good morning.
Stephen, it's good to be back on your championship platform, Mediated Conversations.
It's one thing to design public spaces, but there's a lot here around organisation. Community groups band together. It helps if there's proper organisation from a council. How important is all of that in fighting violent crime? And I'm talking about, patrolling areas, for example.
Stephen, it's very, very critical. Where I was born and bred, Beckersdale, over the weekend I met some young men who have taken it upon themselves to set up the community patrollers, breaking away from the community police forum. In fact, their job is to ensure that the community in the area, in the block where that section is called Uptown, where they live, there is lessened crime. They have identified the hotspots of crime, and they have gone in as young people and men in that area to flag that area, stabilizing it and normalizing it. And this young man says to me, Bra Andy, if you can help us raise a few rand so that we can have resources, we can have all those other things that will instill fear in the criminals when they are either here for robbing or fights or ensuring that they continue to do their evil under the cover of the night. So this says to you and I, Stephen, and the listener, when you provide leadership as members of that community, in the police, in the community policing forum, in the churches, in the women's organizations, all critical stakeholders that belong or that forms a community, you will then be able to stabilize hotspots of crime and normalize them by ensuring that you take control of community from an urban design point of view. I'm talking about the green belts that you spoke about earlier on, where there are green belts and women have to walk through and children to school. You go and you do the grass cutting. You go and you look for people with bush cutters, you ensure that that area is clear and criminals cannot hide in that particular spot. So community structures, internationally, Stephen, I have a responsibility from a gender crime point of view to ensure that communities internationally deal with crimes such as counterfeit goods, human trafficking, organ harvesting, illegal organ harvesting, financial crimes, tax evasion, and many of those things. So communities are critical to safety and security within our communities. While the police have a limited number of bodies that do the patrolling and the vans, which forms the policing resources for crime prevention and crime combating, critical to that would be force multipliers. And force multipliers would be communities as organized as burial societies coming together with the patrollers to ensure that there is safety and security, and there's also fear through flooding into the heart of the criminals.
One of the things that happens when services fail, so it can be anything, it can be water, it can be electricity, people turn to criminality or they turn to whoever can provide it, right? Does that then lead to an increase in criminality? Now you've got people breaking a law, illegal electricity connections as an example. Someone is now able to meet the demand. That starts a whole electricity network. I mean, a whole criminal network.
Stephen, you and I and all other listeners who are able to read into the situation will agree and accept that we have a leadership weakness in South Africa and in our communities, particularly in the space of crime prevention and crime combating. When you look at the State of the Nation address, when it comes to crime prevention through communities, and when you look at the budget and involvement of communities, leadership from the very highest office until up to your local police station, which does not want to work hand in glove with communities, from an intelligence gathering point of view, which is informed by the people in whose yard criminals live. This suggests one thing to both you and I and the listeners, Stephen. It is important that in the course and scope of us trying to prevent crime and combating crime, that we look at other alternatives. Other alternatives would mean new relationships that are informed by what Smart Cities Dive, of which I'm a member internationally, looks at from an infrastructure point of view. Let me conclude on a note that says in Boulder, Colorado, they have what they call encampment communities, people who cannot afford renting and buying houses, who have now started to erect tents and live in those tents. They have a unit that deals with such issues. Key and critical to that would be when we look at the economic situation and we put programs whose money will not be stolen by those in leadership, we can combat crime and we can prevent crime.
Andy Mashaile, thank you very much indeed. Now an Interpol ambassador, lots of experience with community policing forums in his history. So thank you for your time. My thanks also to Sandile Swana, the political analyst and governance expert. You heard his personal stories and views around this issue, urban crime and safety. And Siphelele Ngobese from the SA Cities Network, the researcher, starting us off today. There's a lot more to come, of course, on SAfm. Kathy is back with you this morning. We will see you tomorrow. I think it's going to be one of those busy weeks, even though it's a relatively short week. Also getting a bit chilly on the Highveld as well. So from Zelma Stanza.